Hi, Mr. O'Toole. Good to see you in person. Good to have you here in studio.
It's good to see you, Vashi. It's great to be back.
I appreciate you making the time. Why are you leaving now?
Well, I've had an amazing run. It's been a decade where I served my first few years in government, including in cabinet. Made a real difference, I think, and then in opposition in a number of roles, including leader of the Conservative Party. Almost won the 2021 election, put out ideas that I care deeply about, from mental health to veterans to the Arctic to Canada's role in the world. I think those will continue to ripple, but it's time our new leader has the chance to lead without the old leader kind of hanging around. I think it's a perfect time, and I'm very optimistic for the future and the job I'm having in the private sector. So it's perfect for me and the family.
Do you feel like your party is still the party you wanted to lead?
Absolutely. But the country, as I've always said, the country is more frustrated than a few years ago. And I think the pandemic, from all points of view, and I said this in my last speech, has accelerated some of the divisions along with social media that makes people a little more frustrated. And so I think our new leader is speaking to that and trying to bring an idea and a plan that will bring some of the people that are frustrated with the country, in Western Canada, some of them even giving up on the country, engage them to let them know that Ottawa is listening.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the way in which he and other politicians are engaging, and in particular the way that you framed it in that speech you just mentioned. You said performance politics is fueling polarization, virtue signaling is replacing discussion, and instead of debating our national purpose in this chamber, too many of us are often chasing algorithms down a sinkhole of diversion and division. Why not stay and try to counter that?
I tried to do that in the 2021 election, and I had some success, but ultimately was not successful trying to have people hear the other side. That was what I said in my last official speech as Conservative leader, trying to find solutions on the environment, for example, that would satisfy Conservative voters in rural Alberta, but also urban voters. I think we're having some success, and the pandemic made that more difficult, but losing eroded my sort of trust with some in our caucus and with some of our grassroots. Now the job of the new leader is to make sure that those people feel heard. But as I've said many times, we still need to win more seats in Toronto, in Vancouver, and they're going to want to hear Conservative ideas on everything from the environment to rights to other things. So how do you bring energy policy and concerns about the carbon tax alongside proposals to reduce emissions? That's going to be the secret sauce that Pierre has to find. I wasn't successful in it, and so that's why I think it's time for me to move on.
Do you think that there is the possibility for success in that through the team around Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Poilievre? And I ask that because whenever I speak to any of them, they actually kind of rebuke your approach, the more moderate approach you took during the election versus what you did during the leadership. And they rebuke the idea that they have to moderate at all in order to win those seats that you point out are necessary to form a majority government.
I disagree with them. You know, the Conservatives won the popular vote in the last two elections. It just wasn't efficient enough. And Mr. Trudeau, some of the polarization is actually focusing and over-delivering your small cohort. So he's now won two minority governments with a smaller popular vote, and in some elections being virtually shut out in certain provinces of the country. So I think had the pandemic not been a part of the discussion, I had a lot of fiscal Conservatives that wanted to see the Conservatives with a smart plan on the environment. A lot of business leaders, for example, or small business owners that wanted to make sure they lowered emissions for their kids, but were worried about our competitiveness, worried about trade relations, thought Mr. Trudeau's ethics were questionable. So there's a bunch of voters that want to see the Conservatives address all issues. I think Pierre will do that. And so if you're killing the carbon tax, I tried to propose an alternative, but I think we're going to have to come up with real policy to meet the needs of the country. But I think there's a mood for change, Vashi. I've never seen such tensions out there and frustration with the government. The latest thing over Paul Bernardo is this government's getting casual with the truth. And so I think there's going to be an element where the next election may just be throw the bums out, but we have to be willing to govern for the whole country.
Is blaming the pandemic, though, for your failure to capitalize on that sentiment in 2021 the easy way out?
Well, no, it's what our data told us. But look, I take responsibility for that loss. But I was frustrated by Mr. Trudeau. He didn't get any advice from the civil service on launching a vaccine mandate where people could lose their jobs. I never wanted people to lose their jobs. So Mr. Trudeau led, and that policy led to the convoy and the shutdown. But I was a bit squeezed where I didn't support what he was doing then, nor did I support illegal blockading of cities or bridges. And the tensions of the time, which are starting to dissipate, thankfully, made it hard to be a bit of a bridge builder, but I still think that's what politicians owe their community, regardless of sites. And I said, don't become a follower of your followers, because the algorithms on social media amplify the loud, angry voices on left and right. And if you think that that is a cross-section of real opinion in Canada, you're fooling yourself. And so I think social media, especially when there was no parliament sittings, no interactions that MPs had with constituents at fairs or Rotary Club meetings, they were getting feedback from social media, and it made the divisions and the polarization worse on all sides. So, you know, we have to look in the mirror as much as Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Singh's team.
And I wouldn't abdicate any side, or abdicate responsibility, rather, for any side. But I did want to ask you if you did specifically mean the current leader of the party, Mr. Poilievre, who is very active on social media, who has denounced the quote-unquote Great Reset, who doesn't want to send anyone to the World Economic Forum, all things that you flagged but didn't name him by name.
I think if you say we're not going to participate in the World Economic Forum because it's become a parade of celebrities, or, you know, some of the concerns about it being far too left or anti-energy, that's fair. But I think politicians also then have to say, Canada does have a role in some of these multilateral forums. I think when Stephen Harper went there and promoted us as an energy superpower, for example, that's how you go there and make your case for Canada. But what I think Pierre is doing is addressing some of the frustrations. That is fair. But I do think politicians have to fight against some of these conspiracies that are building, that it's some secret global government, or there's this secret group taking over the world. I have people asking me about that on the streets in my community, Vashi. And what I find is if a politician will address them right up front, handle their concerns, you can actually have a decent conversation. But what we see on social media is there's less and less of that happening. So I think you can have a firm policy like we're planning to have that will address people's concerns, but you then also have to say Canada's a trading nation. We helped draft the NATO Charter. We helped create the Declaration of Human Rights at the United Nations. We have a role on the world stage, and we need to be at a lot of these tables.
What evidence do you have that the leader of your party, that Mr. Poilievre, is trying to thread that needle at all? He isn't just saying, oh, I'm addressing some general concerns about a leftist agenda or perhaps an anti-energy agenda. He is, denouncing Maxime Bernier for ever going there. He is, starting a petition that is against, the Great Reset. That is not weaving the needle that you just laid out.
I think on reconciliation with Indigenous groups and First Nations is something that Pierre is doing well in terms of saying, hey, let's make sure that First Nation communities benefit from resource development.
But I'm asking about conspiracy theories.
Well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is something that people were opposing as part of this UN agenda. I think I see Pierre trying to have that balance. But that was my message, Vashi. My message was not just to my side of the House or the other side of the House. I also took some responsibility for not always getting the balance right as well. So when you have this privilege...
Do you regret any of that? And I'm thinking of the leadership in particular, in which you hired a company or people that were specifically known for their memification of everything.
Well, the leadership contests are different in that you're speaking to a number of Canadians who've already self-selected into a group. They bought a membership and you're speaking just to that group. But I think certain things I didn't have the right tone on. I've talked about that, talking about cancel culture and our... Sir John A. Macdonald statues, and sometimes I didn't have the right tone on that stuff, and I think those conversations are so important, so I always tried to correct. But I think what I see and why I had this in my final message is I've seen this get worse every year. When I first got here over a decade ago, I don't even think Stephen Harper tweeted much or was on Facebook, and he launched this thing called 24/7 that everyone kind of made fun of. But now we're seeing how algorithms actually will feed people's worries and concerns, and politicians have the ability to surf on that, or the ability to say, hey, I understand your concern, and here's how we're going to fix it, with policy. So alienation in the West, here's how we're going to get a pipeline built. Here's how we're going to get emissions down. I tried to do that, not as successfully as I would have liked. But as this gets worse, I think politicians have to rise to the occasion. We also have to have more transparency on algorithms, and we have to look at regulating the tech companies without stifling free speech. So some of the conversations are happening here, but not to the degree I think they need to.
I want to switch gears before I let you go, because you have been very active on the issue of China, and in particular foreign interference. And we actually haven't had an opportunity to speak with you since everything started 4 months ago, technically, through at least the headlines. You were briefed by CSIS about China's activities involving you. And I know you've detailed some of them already. What I wondered, as you kind of detailed what they told you, was, did they tell you anything you didn't already suspect?
Just the degree of coordination was a shock to me. This was not one-off little things. There was connection running through all of them. I had seen glimpses in the campaign and even before and after of some of the misinformation on WeChat and social media, some of the attempts at voter suppression. But that's what I was surprised with, the amount of connections between it all. And I was very careful not to reveal source information, but there's foreign money, there's active people being recruited, there's suppression, and there's misinformation. And they know who's doing it. And so that's why I was very disappointed with Mr. Johnston's report. I think Mr. Trudeau set him up to fail, and he got a snapshot of intelligence and not the whole picture. It's why we need a national inquiry, as much to see, did Mr. Trudeau fail in not responding enough? I think he did fall short. But we have to prepare for the future, because I think all Western democracies are experiencing this. We are less sophisticated on an intelligence and security basis than UK or Australia. And sometimes our golly, oh shucks, we're Canadians, we say sorry, we're not ready for the amount of influence and just ruthless strategy that some nations, like China or Russia, will pursue to influence people and decisions, and particularly the millions of Canadians from diaspora communities. We owe it to them. They come here for the liberty of being able to vote for whoever they want, or throw the bums out, or reject this, reject that. They should never be influenced by a force from outside of Canada.
Is it your impression, and I know you can't speak to specifics, my guess is, but is it your impression that the perpetrators of much of what was described to you are still operating in and among us in Canada?
Yes. Mr. Blair sat on a warrant request from our intelligence services that was going to be a warrant against a very prominent Liberal organizer. That is a red flag. That should have been one decision that Mr. Johnston said, yes, we need an inquiry. I think Mr. Trudeau doesn't want to acknowledge 8 years of poor decisions. And these can add up to a situation where we've allowed this influence and these operations to get to the extent they are. I think there's going to be some very embarrassing pieces of evidence in an inquiry, and that's why the Trudeau government has tried desperately to avoid it, and they're now basically hoping that the last few days of Parliament will pass and they can get on the barbecue circuit. But we owe it to our democracies. I've always said this, let's make this nonpartisan, let's get this retired judge, let's look at this seriously, because we owe it to our democracy and to our citizens that come here for that freedom.
I also want to be clear, based on what you know, do you think it's an issue of competence, or have you assigned intent to the government here?
That's what the inquiry will show. There has been some intent that I think is reckless. When Mr. Trudeau, early as Prime Minister, reversed decisions on takeovers of Canadian security companies that our Conservative government had rejected, those were either incredibly naive or reckless decisions. I think there's now a pattern, after many years, of pivoting too much to try and secure a free trade deal or whatever his end goal was, at a time that China, after 2017, was actually going the wrong direction. It was getting worse in some of the control of the Communist Party over companies and people and surveillance. So we have to recognize we're on the wrong path. Ms. Freeland just canceled investments in the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. I wrote a letter to him several years ago on that. Andrew Scheer, the previous leader, had asked. So I think they're recognizing they've been completely out of step. The issue will be Was it naivety? Was it willful blindness? Was there some influence from some of these organizers, you know, that Mr. Blair was told required surveillance? I think there's a lot of questions that Canadians should have on just, you know, how out of step with our allies Canada has been under the Trudeau government.
Do you acknowledge, though, that the way in which a government in this country approaches the relationship with China is very complicated? And I ask because I just spoke with John Kirby last week on this program. The White House has been, up until the last few weeks, very specific about the way in which they view China, and that relationship has grown more antagonistic by the day. They're all of a sudden reversing course as well. They're saying we want to reset relations. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his way there next week. Is that not sort of emblematic of the fact that it isn't easy to be black and white about China? Our trade last year with them, our imports were the highest on record. Can you acknowledge or concede that it isn't black and white?
I've given dozens of speeches on this, Vashi. It's hard to balance off our interests, economic mainly, with our values. But our values should always come first. And I was very proud of our motion on the genocide towards the Uyghur minority. These things we don't see on a daily basis, but Canada should never trade in goods or products coming from Xinjiang, for example. And these are reasons why we need a foreign influence registry, why we should have a wider discussion of these things, because there's a lot of money to be made, yes, but not at the cost of our values and our soul as Canadians. We, as I said, we wrote that Declaration of Human Rights at the UN. We've got to live it today. So it's not easy. I think the US, their strategic ties with Taiwan is why they want to keep conversation going. There's some analysis that could say China moves on Taiwan in the next few years. We've got Russia's attack on Ukraine. So I think the US doesn't want to lose the ability to reduce tensions in the Taiwan Strait. But Canada as an ally, we should be firmly in the Five Eyes AUKUS without Canada group of countries to make sure that we're aligned and we're promoting Western values alongside our trade opportunities.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there, Mr. O'Toole. Thank you very much and best of luck.
Thank you.